the shirt, or does it matter?
That's fine, actually, right there.
Well, hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the New College Socratic stage. These events seek to advance civil discourse and engagement through facilitating events that foster open discussion and debate on relevant public policy issues. Before we get too far ahead into the main event, I would like to take a quick moment to thank our generous sponsors, Michael and Lang Markovitz, who have made these events possible. So a quick round of applause. Thank you. My name is Mark Gordon. I am the managing editor of the Business Observer newspaper, which is a weekly print product and digital online coming out every day. We cover business news from Tampa to Sarasota, writing about entrepreneurs, businesses, companies, big and small, and nonprofits as well. And so I'm honored to be here. Thanks for having me. We're going to have a constructive conversation tonight. We're going to seek to answer the question, is America still a capitalist country? You've all been presented with a QR code that I think is going to be up on the screen, allow you to answer this question, is America still a capitalist country? Please use your phones to vote. Polling will be open for the next few minutes. At the end of the presentation, we will open the poll back up to see if these three gentlemen have changed your mind and you want to change your answer. So we're in Florida. We know how to count votes well, not like Pennsylvania. Yeah, you'll be able to submit your questions using the same code. Ask the speakers during the Q&A portion of the evening. All right, did everybody have a chance to vote? Okay. All right, I'm going to start with, we're going to introduce, this is Bruce Gilley, comes to New College as a distinguished professor in political science. And I also learned in the green room back there, Bruce is a accomplished world traveler. Asia, Australia, many other places. Excellent, so you're going to take the, am I going to introduce all three?
I think you're going to introduce all three.
Oh, got it, okay. Tarron, Khemraj, yes, I got it. Professor of Economics and International Studies here at New College. And last but not least, Sean Adams is the Hyatt and C.C. Brown Professor of History and the Interim Associate Dean for the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at the University of Florida. And as I mentioned to Sean, I have a 16-year-old that I'm trying to steer toward University of Florida. He has no tips for me right now, but we'll see after the presentation. Yeah. Awesome, Bruce, why don't you kick us off with your presentation?
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks Mark for moderating here tonight. Is the United States still a capitalist country? The answer is no. You may have noted on Monday of this week, Spirit Airlines filed for bankruptcy. The capitalists who had put their money into this low-cost airline have lost everything. Was this because Spirit Airlines was a bad idea or was managed badly? No, it was actually a great idea. It was managed very well. Rather, the bankruptcy of Spirit Airlines is because the United States is no longer a capitalist country. It is what I will call a predatory economy, in which productive capital is formally under the legal ownership of private investors, but in fact controlled by government and anti-capitalist social activists. Spirit, as you may know, was bankrupted because the Biden administration blocked two merger attempts by Spirit that would have saved the airline. But actually, the regulatory assault on Spirit goes back much further. Twice, its pilot union had the NLRB's backing for strike actions, which ended up burdening the airline with pay packages that undermined its entire business model. Again, government bureaucrats, not the market, was in charge of the productive capital of this airline. There's more. In the 5 years to 2019, Spirit paid 25% of its net income to government in taxes. This is an industry where long-term costs and the risks of sudden downturns in aviation traffic require adequate reserves. Of course, when that sudden drop in passengers came, guess what? The government stepped in to give with one hand what it had taken with the other, paying Spirit to keep its staff from engaging in productive labor by complying with illiberal lockdown measures. Rather than a capitalist response to COVID, where companies would have drawn on adequate reserves, banks would have provided bridge loans, passengers would have made risk choices about whether to fly, the government nationalized the economy along with Spirit Airlines, a dip from which this airline never recovered. Guess who benefits from the Spirit bankruptcy? Of course, the woke big corporations that now dominate most industries in the United States. They can pay all the compliance costs for the nuisance regulations. They can continually cave into unions by passing on the cost to consumers since there's no competition, and they immediately sign up for the latest social justice crusade that the predatory state demands. So the Spirit Airlines bankruptcy is, for me, the perfect miniature of the argument for why the United States is no longer a capitalist country. The regulatory tools that the predatory state deploys, interventions in market decisions, interventions in labor markets, excessive taxation, price controls, and much else, has nothing to do with making markets fairer or products and services safer, but is merely the plunder of capital. This renders the description of our economy as capitalist untenable. Your federal predatory government is at work in many other markets, by the way. The FTC, you may know, has sued to block the merger of Kroger and Albertsons, which as a combined grocery store would account for, wait for it, 14% of the United States grocery market, practically a monopoly. What else? The FTC has sued to block another merger between two companies that was upheld by a New York court last month. What is the industry they're in? High-speed internet? Defense technology? No, cheap female handbags. That's right. The federal government has decided it needs to run the cheap female handbag industry in our country. That's a predatory state. That's not a capitalist economy. David Brooks of the New York Times has described the effects of the increased economic cost of the predatory state, compliance officers, lawyers, human resource managers, ESG consultants as, quote, death by 1,000 paper cuts, unquote. This is a big reason, by the way, why productivity growth in the American economy is so sluggish. When I grew up, people used to read the book In Search of Excellence. Today, they probably read a book called In Search of Lawyers and Compliance Officers. No insult to lawyers, by the way. One of the methods used by statists to destroy capitalism, Ayn Rand famously wrote, consists in establishing controls that tie a given industry hand and foot, making it unable to solve its problems, then declaring that freedom has failed and stronger controls are necessary. But wait, you might say, isn't the US generally considered a highly capitalist country in most rankings? I mean, if you look at indexes of economic freedom, the US is usually ranked up fairly high. Well, that's true, but don't forget that these indexes are all relative. They tell us nothing about the absolute state of economic freedom in a country. You may recall that Yugoslavia was always considered to be the most market-oriented economy in the socialist bloc. Well, that's true. That didn't make Yugoslavia a capitalist state. We are, in a sense, the Yugoslavia of the Western economic world. As I mentioned, the predatory economy operates not just through direct government control of capital, but also by employing social actors who tie down capital in their own forms of extortion. Do you know that you'll soon be unable to get a taxi or an Uber in New York City? Why is that? Because the state enacted a no-fault auto accident policy that led to a creation of criminalized litigation rackets in the city. What they do is they stage a bicyclist accident who runs a red light, crashes into a taxi, then they bring on the litigation teams who bilk the taxi company for millions, which is leading to the expectation that most taxi companies and share lifts in New York City will be out of business. All those billboards you see with trial lawyers touting the millions they extract from honest companies are just legalized criminal rackets. Frauds, shysters, out in the open, a criminalized economy that preys upon the predatory state that they exist within. Litigation based on junk claims and junk science now makes it impossible for small companies to survive in many sectors. The near bankruptcy of Bayer after it inherited the Roundup litigation from Monsanto will go down in history, I believe, as one of the most egregious attacks on capitalism of the 20th century. All of that, by the way, took place through American courts. And companies cannot really win, they can just gain a reprieve from this kind of predatory economy. Both of the two largest meat producers in the United States, JBS Foods and Tyson Foods, caved in to social justice activists and declared they would be net zero by 2040 several years ago. What happened, of course? It's impossible to be net zero if you're a meat company. And what happens then? The predatory state turns around and sues them for greenwashing, claiming that they haven't been honest and forthcoming about the fact that they won't achieve net zero, a goal that was forced upon them in the first place by the predatory state's willingness to threaten them with lawsuits based on their emissions. Unions are the other social actor empowered by the predatory state, well beyond their appropriate role as collective bargaining agents to seize the control of capital. The most basic idea of capitalism, of course, as the word implies, is that it's capital, not labor, that runs the show. Labor is given a range of options within the system, and its role is to seek the best deal it can. The reason we have capitalism as opposed to laborism, which is the term actually that the Labour Party of the UK used to use, is we have found through experience that capitalism works better. It delivers more wealth than a laboristic economy. So what do we have in the US right now? Capitalism or laborism? Well, if you look at major sectors of the economy, we have something closer to laborism. The union that controls the East Coast and Gulf Coast ports, as you may know, shut down those ports for 3 days until the Biden administration stepped in and forced the ports to cave in to their wage demands. This is a union, by the way, that maintains 2 workers for every 1 job and walks around on strike with the Luddite slogan, "Fight automation." Fight automation. You'll be glad that the textiles industry, which was faced with similar sector-wide strikes, eventually, thanks to a 1947 bill called the Taft-Hartley Bill, overcame sector-wide strikes in the textiles industry. Otherwise, those $40 jeans you're wearing would have cost $400, and we could thank junior Congressman Richard Nixon for the Taft-Hartley Bill. It's not just unions. The federal government has all sorts of other regulatory tools to, in effect, force companies to hire and pay people, not based on their productivity, but based on some half-baked ideology. The Biden administration sued SpaceX for not hiring enough Hispanic workers. Of course, Elon Musk, being Elon Musk, sued back, but he's the exception. Most companies just bow and scrape. The Equal Opportunities Employment Commission, EEOC, enforces something that's called pay equity, which has 0 basis in economic fact. It's kind of the Barbie movie with lawyers. The EEOC runs around finding companies where in a given job, a man might be paid more than a woman and sues them. Most companies don't have compliance officers. They're trying to make their business run. They just cave in and pay a fine. You can read all about it. Actually, by the way, in the American economy today, Asian women out-earn white men, but we don't see EEOC lawyers running around suing companies that have highly paid Asian women. And indeed, all women out-earn all men in many job categories. Again, we don't see the EEOC running around suing those companies who overpay women. Why? Because they know this is just fraud. This is a predatory economy that is interfering in the normal working out of the capitalist economy. All this, of course, reduces the wage share of income, which has not changed much since the end of World War II. And it also keeps after-tax profits at a lower level than they would otherwise be, which is part of the reason why our productivity growth has been so slow. Where's all this money coming from? Of course, it's coming from the federal government, which now, along with state and local governments, accounts for 36% of our economy. More than a third of our economy comes from government spending. Came close to half during the COVID pandemic. Interest on our federal debt is now greater than defense spending. Predatory socialism is now greater than capitalism. There's even direct government ownership in many sectors of the American economy, which you may not know about. 50% of healthcare spending in the US comes from government programs. 40% of our residential home mortgages are bought by the Freddie Mae and Fannie Mac. American agriculture is essentially a nationalized industry because of the role of subsidies. Water supply, interestingly, an industry that is entirely privatized in Europe, is still a state industry in the United States. Passenger rail, meanwhile, has failed repeatedly under state ownership, not just Amtrak, but state-level initiatives in California and New Jersey, which is probably why we're trying to move towards privatization of it here, Nevada, and Texas. I should add, the flip side of the regulatory taking of capitalists is the regulatory giving back when capitalism fails. It used to be in the United States that when a company failed, the owners lost their shirts, the lenders lost their loans, and the workers lost their jobs. That's how capitalism works, by weeding out inefficient firms and rewarding efficient ones. But today, when major firms fail, they get bailouts and compensation. Big car firms, big banks, big steel companies, big anything can now more or less reliably depend on government running to the rescue to declare that capitalism has failed when capitalism is doing exactly what it intended to do. Capitalism, says the British economist Ruchir Sharma in his new book, What Went Wrong with Capitalism, has lost its dynamism, suffering fewer recessions thanks to constant stimulus with even less cleansing effects, thanks to bailouts, leaving behind more bad monopolies, more corporate deadwood. The result is that productivity growth is more and more disappointing, slowing overall growth, leaving the capitalist system with less and less potential to advance the greater good. You may recall President Trump in his 2019 State of the Union address declaring that America will never be a socialist country. Go watch that video. It's very funny to see the Democrats not sure whether to clap or not clap. And finally, Chuck Schumer stands up and goes, "Come on, guys, get up, get up, get up," because they weren't really sure whether they believed in socialism on the Democratic side. But what's interesting is he prefaced that comment by saying, America was founded on liberty and independence, and not government coercion, domination, and control. Trump correctly defined socialism in its modern sense, not as state ownership of the means of production, but as state domination, control, and coercion of the means of production. Can we expect a pullback of this predatory economy in the next 4 years? Yes, maybe. Elon and Vivek say they'll do it in 18 months. Actually, I think it'll take longer. This predatory economy is baked into our governmental system, and undoing it will take the work of not one administration, but generations of freedom-loving Americans. Thank you.
Go for it.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Mark, for introducing us. So I'm going to do two things here tonight. I'm going to outline several conditions which a capitalist society should meet, and after which I will outline several stylized facts, some important data points. And what I will demonstrate is the United States is a capitalist country, but I will conclude that this capitalist country has not delivered for the masses. So what makes capitalism, right? The first thing that makes capitalism is competition, right? And by competition, we must have markets. And we have many markets in the US or in the world. And yes, under mercantilism, we had markets, but we did not have capitalism. There are certain features of capitalism, right? There was not a well-developed labor market. A slave economy is not a capitalist economy, right? In ancient China, along the Yangtze, in South India, right? In ancient Persia, in Mali, you had trading cities, but they were not capitalists. They were craft economies, right? So what makes a society a capitalist country is when the market allocates resources and when the market gives us price signals to allocate these resources. One of the ways we do this is through the labor market. And I can tell you, if I want a job, I have to go compete on the free market, academic market. There is no one to give me a job, right? So the thing about competition is it is the horizontal aspect of capitalism. However, this competition assumes certain conditions will prevail. One of which, we all have equal access to information. Do we have equal access to information in this land? We must also not only have equal access to information, we should not have barriers to entry to any particular industry. Now, you may argue that regulations create barriers to entry, and that is true, but for a capitalist society to work, for a market system to allocate resources, as it does in the United States, we must have some regulations. Which one of you here tonight is going to put your money in the equity markets of this country, the most dynamic equity markets in the world, had it not been for disclosure laws? Do you want to be ripped off, right? Why is it that China is finding it difficult to sell its bonds internationally? It is because we have well-regulated financial markets in this country, and I have the confidence to go on my Robinhood or any trading platform and put my hard, very little earned, underpaid money in it. Yes, and we are underpaid in the state university system, has always been, right? And we were treated badly by our legislature. Keep that, right? We were always treated badly. We were underfunded. Right? Capitalism cannot work without regulation. Look, I started traveling between here and JFK with JetBlue in 2008, sorry. And I can witness the deterioration of service of JetBlue, right? I have a JetBlue card, a credit card, right? So when we have airlines that are becoming less competitive, more as oligopolies, what happens? The quality of our services decline, right? And you will have a storm, and you will not have your flight, but you will not get your discount, okay? So what we need are regulation. Now, what I am saying, though, is yes, governments can overreach, and governments can do harm by over-regulating. I don't have to tell you. If you think regulation, I'm not saying regulations are all good or bad. New college, we are subjected to some terrible regulations by our board of governors, by this state, right? The metric system has destroyed this college, right? Right? Literally, I have the numbers. Anybody who wants to debate me, I am willing to debate, right? I am willing to debate this. The rate of decline of this college started in 2018 when the Board of Governors introduced a regulatory regime, right? And I will go to my grave believing, right, that regulatory regime was implemented to destroy this college, okay? I have no apologies to make. Now, you need regulations. The Biden administration makes a huge error. And here is the error. We need consolidation of regional banks. And by preventing the merger of regional banks, we are making the financial system more unstable. The Biden administration is, however, correct to prevent the mergers of airlines, right? So we have now talked about the first aspect of capitalism, the competition aspect. However, we should not be misled. There is a command aspect to capitalism. There is a vertical, hierarchical aspect to capitalism, right? The growing industry concentration. Now, some of this is because of brilliant entrepreneurs who have ideas, and they are able to earn that right to grow and concentrate. But we should, however, be aware that there is a limit to concentration, because we know when you have an oligopolistic industrial structure, the price that industry charges will always be above its marginal costs. And not only will it be above its marginal cost, it will earn the industry supernormal profits, which are different from normal profits, right? Normal profits means you are covering your true opportunity cost of doing business, okay? What else? What other examples do we have of this command structure of capitalism? Who writes the laws of this land? Who, right? Those with the financial power who can buy lobbyists to write the laws of this land. So when I talk about this command aspect of capitalism, this is what I mean. Let us talk. I'm going to give you a wager here tonight. The border is never going to be closed, right? The illegal immigration problem will not be solved, right? Why would it not be solved? It's not going to be solved because there is a consistency of interest of two constituencies. One, you get a regular army of cheap labor, and two, you can race bait at election times, right? That is why it will never solve. And I wager anyone, by the way, I will wager tonight 6-pack Bud Lights, right? Anyone here tonight. This problem will not be solved, right? So what I'm saying here, first aspect of capitalism, we have this hierarchy, we have this horizontal, beautiful aspect of capitalism. If we can get to Adam Smith's version, in Smith's time, we were talking about a system of small businesses competing, but it wasn't fun for the workers though, right? But nevertheless, there was this beautiful system that he was describing, because where did capitalism start? Capitalism started in North England, right? Around the 1720s. It's a unique system, right? And we have capitalism when we have voluntary labor forces, right? So I am saying that regulations can overstep, and regulations are necessary, and especially financial regulations. But I'm fine. Let's prevent the airlines from gouging us. I'm perfectly fine with that. Those regulations I can live with. There's a third feature of capitalism. And that third feature is change. Capitalism is a dynamic system. Communism collapsed because communism cannot change. It cannot adapt. It's not flexible. When you fly in an airplane, the wings are going like this. It doesn't break because it is engineered to be flexible. And capitalism is a flexible system. It can adapt. And Now, we go through structural change, structural transformations, as development economists like myself like to write about, right? We were an agrarian society, then we move into manufacturing, and we still manufacture in terms of aggregate output. It's just that the labor force is now employed more in the services sector, high-end services, okay? So we go through these structural change. Entrepreneurs drive a lot of this technical change. They innovate, right? They do interesting things, right? So, but however, entrepreneurs are not going to do the fundamental research that is necessary. Yes, we can praise Elon for his rocket that came back, but the initial math they're partial differential equations, and we have a professor at New College. They do this kind of research, right? We are the people who are writing the papers, who are providing the initial spark, right? And without us, the capitalist system will not have the basic fundamental ideas. It was the professors, right, who, funded by government, who came up with the concept of messenger RNA, right? If you don't have the concept of messenger RNA, you can't make a vaccine, right? And that concept is eventually, we're going to have cocktail treatment for cancer in 10 years, right? But who came up with the initial spark? Those guys in colleges, crazy guys like me, right? We do the research, right? And in business schools or in physics department and biology departments. So I'm saying entrepreneurs are great for change. They provide that impetus. But the fundamental science is coming from places like NASA, people who just want to create things for the sake of creating things. I like published papers. I like to publish papers because I love doing it. I don't want, it's just fun, right? I'm not expecting to get a big pay out of it, and there are thousands of people doing that. There's a fourth dimension of capitalism, and it's freedom. Yes, capitalism can provide us with certain freedom. Milton Friedman believed that capitalism and freedom go hand in hand. I tend to agree, but I disagree on one. I have to qualify this. And the qualification I would like to make is you need a democratic system. You need a democratic system for capitalism to truly give us the freedom and choices, right? If we are lucky, we're going to get, so I have my simple identity equation. Capitalism plus democracy equals a superior system, right? Democracy is a spectrum. It's not a 0-1. It's not a binary concept. We are on a spectrum of 0 to 1. I'd say Florida, we are about 0.6. Just keep that in mind, right? Or maybe 0.5. I don't feel very free in this state anymore. I can tell you that. So let's talk about these stylized facts. Look at it. Anybody, just email me. I'll send you my slides. Profit as a share of GDP by corporations. My data point starts from 1929. It's the highest it has ever been. Profit as a share of GDP by corporations are the highest it's ever been. Look at the chart, right? I'm happy to share my slide. However, there's a problem. There's a problem. If you look at the share of profit relative to GDP of small businesses, the medium-scale businesses, the sole proprietorships, the partnerships, look at how it was very high in 1947, 15.8%. Right now, it's averaging 6.8%. So if I were government, this is where the help needs to be. We have to think about how we can raise the profit share of our sole proprietorships, our mom and pops, our small businesses. This trend is not a good one. The labor share, Professor Gilley mentioned this. Look at what's happened to it's not fun, huh? Look at it. This is the labor share. My data set starts 1947. The share that workers get relative to GDP is plummeting across political regimes. Why? Right? These are questions I hope we ask. Wealth inequality, look at the trend. This chart shows the amount of wealth the top 1% of this country owns. Let me give you some numbers. In 2015, the top 1% in America owned $26.1 trillion. $26.1 trillion. In 2023, the top 1%, the richest 1% of this country now owns $44.4 trillion. For context, the GDP in the third quarter of 2024 of the United States was $29.4 trillion nominal. These are all nominal. So you have to compare nominal with nominal, as I tell my students, right? Real with real, nominal with nominal, right? So keep that in mind, huh? And I'm one of those actually who don't believe our wealth tax will be effective, but I'm just throwing this out there, right? I don't believe in wealth tax. Now look at that was wealth inequality. What about income inequality? Look at the trends. It fell from 29 from the 1980s. It went straight up. The rate of the rise in inequality by the Gini coefficient is rising still, but it has slowed, right? As I was telling my development economics students yesterday, that this is an important measure because it predicts many things, discontents, right? So how has American capitalism delivered? I have a chart of our life expectancy, but I'm not going to talk about this chart. I'm going to talk about 2 data points. Well, before I mention there are some bright spots, we are still spending our research and development expenditure as a society. It's on an upward trajectory still. And once we keep it there is hope. This is really where the secret sauce is. We got to spend on research and development, basic science, commercial science. This is the way. If you keep doing this, we'll be fine, right? Regulations are not going to turn us down, right? So yes, we are still on a good trajectory. Again, anyone who wants my charts, I will share them, the red line. But finally, let me talk about these numbers. How is this capitalist system delivering? I'm going to talk first about the Human Development Index. It's an index that combines our average income, how long we live, educational attainment, health outcomes. In the year 2022, the US ranks 20th, right? United Arab Emirates now is ahead of us, right? In the year 2022. Remember, life expectancy, how well we do in education outcomes, health outcomes. In the year 2015, we ranked 10th. So from 2015 to 2022, we're down 10 places, right? In the year 2010, we were 4th in the world in human development outcome. So the trend is clear. We're moving in the wrong direction. Yes, we are becoming richer in the aggregate, but things are not looking so well. Life expectancy, let's compare it. The United States in the year, we're only going to look at 2022 numbers. 77.43. If you were born today, you were expected to live, if current conditions prevail, 77.3. Canada, 81.3. France, socialist France, 82.23. United Kingdom, 82.06. Germany, 80.71. Italy, 82.9. Must be the pizza. I love pizza. Japan, 84. South Korea, 82.6. I'm putting in some developing countries now. Costa Rica, just slightly below the US, 77.32. Remember, the US, 77.43. Barbados, 77.71, slightly ahead of the US. Chile, 79.52. What I'm saying is, what these numbers show is that American capitalism is not delivering the good life for a large percentage of the population. Thank you for listening, and I love to gesticulate and sometimes get excited when I lecture. But I love you all and thank you for listening.
Well, thanks everyone for being here, and thank you all for inviting me to come down from the howling wilds of north central Florida to this beautiful place. What I'm going to do as a historian, and I've been an interim associate dean for some time now, so this is a real treat to actually talk about ideas rather than budgets and things like that. What I'm going to do is, as a historian, do the annoying thing that historians often do, which is to say, I'm going to reshape the question and talk a little bit about not whether or not America is now a capitalist nation or not, but whether or not America has always been a capitalist nation. And I hope that you'll see what I mean here, because what I'd like to do is very briefly, in 10 minutes or so, is go over some challenges that American capitalism has faced, and I think that my overall argument is that American capitalism is quite resilient in the face of these challenges, very, very distinct, different challenges. I teach a class, for example, at the University of Florida on the history of American capitalism, and we start right at the beginning with Adam Smith, right? It's very convenient. Sometimes history does these wonderfully convenient things, is that Adam Smith wrote Wealth of Nations in 1776, and the United States was born in 1776. And so one question that historians always ask is kind of, is America born capitalist, right? And if you look at Smith's world, he creates this invisible hand, as he calls it, a kind of magic formula, right, where he says, essentially, it's not through the benevolence of the baker and the butcher that we get our daily meal, but from their self-interest. And so what I ask my students is, how can you have a system where you let everybody pursue their self-interest and you just don't have chaos and anarchy, right? What Adam Smith says is the invisible hand of the market solves all that, right? It drives out bad producers, allows good producers to persist, and that is the way he was. What's interesting about Adam Smith, too, is he's describing what he says exists. And coincidentally, Marx did the same thing. Marx and Smith, very, very different views on capitalism, but both said, I'm describing what exists. I'm not saying what should be. I'm saying what is. So we start with that, and then I have to, and I think there are some undergrads here tonight. I hope there are. You guys like working definitions, right? And so I give a working definition of capitalism. Now, we could spend the next hour and a half, probably the next 20 years, coming up with a definitive definition of capitalism, but I'm going to offer three main points, right? What capitalism is to me, a historian, is an economic system that has, number one, private ownership of society's productive assets, right? Private ownership is a key. Second, the prevalence of markets in allocating scarce resources, right? We can't all have everything that we want, so we have to allocate it in some way, and we use a market system in order to do that. And then finally, and this one might be the most controversial in capitalism, is the profit motive as the driving force behind action. That is the self-interest, right? The baker doesn't make bread because he loves us all. The baker makes bread because they want to feed their own family. They want to earn a living. So was the United States born capitalist? The first challenge that I want to talk about to American capitalism actually comes from historians ourselves. Now, I'm not going to sit here and talk about historiography. That would be horrendous for us all, for me to do that. But I do want to talk about what historians call the market revolution. It's an interpretation of American capitalism from about the time of the American Revolution to the Civil War. And essentially what it argues is this, that the United States was this place of self-sufficient yeoman farmers, the kind of Jeffersonian vision of the small farmer working on a small plot of land, producing what he, and it's very gendered, what he could for himself and his family, maybe going off and buying goods that he couldn't produce himself, like iron pots and so forth. The whole nation, or at least the whole North, was dotted with these small family farms. They didn't truck in currency. They used barter economies. If you needed eggs, your neighbor would give you eggs, and you might give them a chicken in response. And then the market coming out. The reason why they call it the market revolution is the idea is that the United States was not a capitalist society, right? This was the project. The project of many folks who adhered to this market revolution interpretation was to say, the United States wasn't born capitalist. It became a capitalist economy in the early 19th century. as a result of greed, as a result of folks expanding out from the cities, kind of encapsulating and snaring these yeoman farmers in the web of commerce, right? And the next thing you know, they're converting their eggs to cash, what we call the commodity fetish, right? You're converting everything into cash and then using that cash to buy other things. But then as they became enamored with this market economy, they became dependent upon it. And so that project largely has been discredited because it ignores wide swaths of society. It ignores the commercial classes in the cities that were quite prosperous and were adhering to all three aspects of the economy that I talked about, the capitalist economy I talked about. It ignores the slave economy. And historians recently, I don't want to get into particular titles or anything, although I can, historians recently have really demonstrated quite definitively that what was going on in the American South before the Civil War was essentially capitalist. It was a commodification of human bodies, horrific, immoral, a stain on American history, but nonetheless, if you look at what these planners were doing, they were keeping books, they were quite astute accountants, they were efficient managers, but they were slave owners. And the market revolution kind of ignored all of that. So that's the first challenge. It comes from the historians themselves. The second challenge, I want to move forward into the late 19th century. The populist movement. I'm sure you guys all remember the populist movement. I'm going to give you guys a reason why you all know essentially the populist movement in a second here. But before that, I'm going to describe it. So what the populist movement was an alternative to industrial capitalism, which was the system at the time, right? What populists believed you could do was use cooperation rather than competition in order to further human material life. They believed, for example, that farmers should, well, there's some rhetorical aspects to it. Populists say things like farmers need to raise less corn and more hell, and they had these speakers with names, great names like Sockless, Jerry Simpson, and so forth. But what populists really believed in was nationalizing the railroads, right, because they were rapacious and really, really harming farmers. They believed in collectivization. They believed in cooperation, of pooling resources together for the benefit of all. Now, it gets complicated because it gets into kind of currency reform and so forth. But in the 1880s and 1890s, the populists had a whole alternative movement to industrial capitalism. And it kind of reaches its apex in 1896 with William Jennings Bryan, who gives this speech called The Cross of Gold, where he says, if you burn down the cities, they'll spring up overnight. But if you burn down the land where people earn a living, the nation will be ruined. And he says, you're not going to crucify mankind on this cross of gold. And then he lost the election of 1896. But not before the populists really provided a viable alternative to capitalism that failed. And here's how you guys all know about capitalism. You all know the movie The Wizard of Oz. Frank Baum was an editor who wrote about the populists, didn't particularly like them, and so he used metaphors. The scarecrow, farmers. They didn't have a brain, right? They believed in these ideas about collectivization. The Tin Man, the workers. The Cowardly Lion, William Jennings Bryan. So, we all know about the populists, and they failed as an alternative. Socialism. Socialism has a past in the United States. I realize it gets mentioned a lot today, but socialism actually was a fairly popular political movement in the early 20th century. They had folks like Victor Berger, who was a congressman from Wisconsin, who ran on, not necessarily on hardcore Marxist ideology, but stuff like, maybe we shouldn't use formaldehyde to preserve milk, right? Maybe we should have some sort of municipal form. They called him Marxists. Hardcore Marxists called people like Victor Berger derisively sewer socialists, right? They believe in actually materially helping people rather than the dictatorship of the proletariat. What's wrong with them? But this worked in American politics, and socialism rises to the point where Eugene Debs, who is the socialist candidate for president in 1912, actually wins 901,000 votes. Now, you could make the argument that socialism was repressed out of existence. Victor Berger, who I talked about, he came on the wrong end of the Espionage Act of 1917. He's actually refused his seat in Congress in 1919. They throw it back to a special election in Milwaukee. He was from around Milwaukee. Milwaukeeans vote him into office by an even higher margin as a kind of alternative to Congress's action. But nonetheless, he's never really an important political figure again. Eugene V. Debs also is arrested in 1918. He actually runs for president from prison in 1920, and they distributed buttons that say, I'm voting for inmate number 996251, or whatever his inmate number was. So one could maybe argue that socialism was oppressed out of existence and therefore wasn't an alternative to capitalism. But actually, as a historian, I have to go with what was actually true, which is that socialism was never all that popular. Yes, Eugene V. Debs won a series of votes in 1912, but the Socialist Party of America really never had more than 150,000 members. It was not a party, a working class party was never really going to form in the United States. And why? I love the term that was coined by the German sociologist Werner Sombart, who said that why no socialism in the United States? He argues that American socialism was wrecked on the shoals of roast beef and apple pie. That basically capitalism delivers. Capitalism delivers material goods to people, and that's why Americans never really devoted themselves fully to a separate working class party. Now let's talk about the New Deal, because I think this is something, so in alternatives to capitalism, I've given you guys the market revolution view, the populists, the socialists. Bruce has given us the predatory capitalists. But I think that what that comes out of is really the New Deal order, because that's the thing that we're still struggling over today. Republicans want to peel back the New Deal order. Democrats look back lovingly at it. But here I want to historicize the New Deal a little bit. The New Deal that you guys might think about, and the one that we're often wrestling with today, for example, Social Security, that's the second New Deal. There's two New Deals, and if you take my class in American capitalism, you'll hear this over and over and over again. There's two New Deals. The first one is really interesting. It lasts from about 1933, after FDR is inaugurated, to 1935, when the Supreme Court strikes down the National Recovery Act. And it's really related. It's very much similar to what Bruce was describing in terms of predatory capitalism. During the first New Deal, in order to revive what seemed to be a dying system, the Democrats offered an alternative with the National Recovery Act. And what they did was they created these industrial codes. Now, what these codes were basically codes that regulated prices, hours of labor, conditions of labor, market share. It froze market share. It basically said, Ford, you've got 40% of automobile market share. It's now codified. You get 40%, no more, no less. They tried to re-educate Americans on what competition meant. For example, competition became known among the NRA as economic cannibalism. Rugged individualists became known as industrial pirates. Reducing prices to gain market shares, a classic strategy of capitalists, was denounced as cutthroat and monopolistic price slashing. And those who did it, the NRA said, were chiselers. The NRA, the National Recovery Act, is, as I said, it's legislated out of existence by, there's a court case, and the Supreme Court makes it illegal, and then Roosevelt, of course, threatens to pack the court, and it turns into a whole thing. We get the second New Deal, in which Roosevelt basically does all the things that we think of as the New Deal order. Social Security, he has what's called a soak the rich tax, and so on and so forth. So what we're really struggling with here is the idea of whether the United States truly had an alternative to capitalism, right? Because if we're going to say that the United States isn't a capitalist country, you have to look at the alternative. And in history, we always look for these points of contingency, right? Points where things could have broken one way or the other. I've given you a few of them, but the one that I think is really, really interesting, now it might be symbolic because it's a piece of failed legislation, and we don't often look at failed legislation, but if we look at 1946, and if we think about the situation the United States was in 1946, they had just come out of World War II. They had in essence, a command economy in place in World War II. The government set prices, set working conditions. Actually, much more of the kind of first New Deal attitude towards managing the economy. It really was a command economy, but the argument was this was an emergency that was needed to fight the war. But in 1946, Congress proposed the Employment and Production Act of 1946. And in the Senate version of that bill, and I'm going to read this quote, it stated that all Americans able to work and seeking work have the right to useful, remunerative, regular, and full-time employment, and basically tied federal funds to ensuring full-time employment. Now, this failed. It didn't make it through. But what I argue is that is a moment in which the United States could have gone in a dramatically different direction if you had the federal government ensuring full employment. So those are the alternatives. And I think that my main point here is, from a historical view, American capitalism is quite resilient. It evolves. It changes. We see what some political economists call varieties of capitalism. It's not an essential system that remains unchanged from Wealth of Nations, because the system that Adam Smith was describing was in 1776 in the UK. It doesn't apply to the 21st century economy. But those three basic elements, private ownership, the prevalence of markets, and the profit motive, I would argue, have survived several pretty extreme challenges over history and will continue to survive today. Thanks.
Variety of opinions on, is America a capitalist country? I mean, Sean did a great job, I think, on the definitions, because I think it's really important to define what capitalism is and isn't and what the opposite is. So we're going to play a little game. We're each going to have 2 minutes. You're going to pretend here that this is Shark Tank and these are your investors, and you're going to sell them capitalism, or you're going to sell them a different system than capitalism so you could win, get the investment, and open your business called Capitalism, Inc. So, Sean, we'll start with you, and we'll work our way back this way. You have 2 minutes. You're selling capitalism to this audience.
As a system?
Yes.
Okay.
Or if you want an alternative, what is the alternative? That's your other business.
Oh, I just talked about how all the alternatives failed.
Yes.
So that would
That's probably not what
that
you're
would
gonna
probably
do.
not be a good strategy for me to do. I think that the thing that is really significant, and again, I'm going to be an annoying historian here, it's a product of the Enlightenment, right? And one of the things that you get in the Enlightenment is this focus on the individual. And so what I would argue is, if you value your freedom as an individual, you should value capitalism. Because what capitalism allows you to do, what the visible hand allows you to do, is to pursue your interests and not necessarily worry about whether or not you're doing the right thing. Because what the visible hand says is, if you're doing the right thing, or if you're doing something efficiently, then you're in essence doing the right thing. Now, does this turn into then greed is good, in the words of the other political economist, Gordon Gekko? It might. Do you guys know Wall Street? Okay, I didn't know whether that reference was going to fly or not. I show that scene. You know, what's interesting about that scene is that Oliver Stone wanted Gordon Gekko to be a villain, but apparently the speech was delivered so charismatically that he became a hero. And when my students watch that, some of them get up and kind of pump their fists at the end of it. So if you value your individual freedom and you want a society in which everybody is able to pursue their own self-interest without worrying about what their neighbor is doing, well, then capitalism is the system for you.
Tarron, what's your system that you're selling?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, capitalism, as I said earlier, it's not a perfect system. It's the best one we've got. What I will say, however, is for capitalism to bring out the freedoms, and I agree, capitalism provides us with choices. It gives us the opportunity to be free, to innovate, to create things. It does require democracy. It requires democratic freedom. It requires us to minimize the command aspect of capitalism, which I spoke about a few minutes ago. And let's try to maximize the horizontal aspect that is dependent on voluntary exchange. If we can get that world, we'll be better off, and maybe we will also start increasing the labor share, do better for small businesses in this country. And I'm selling you democratic capitalism. That's what I'm selling.
Selling a version of it. I like it. Bruce, what's your pitch? What's your elevator pitch?
So I guess what I'm hearing from Tarron and Sean is a little bit of a kind of means-ends justification for capitalism. Like, we'll put up with it because we probably think it probably is doing good for, society or the workers or academics or something. It's kind of like we're tolerating the capitalists. We're tolerating people's right to mix their labor with capital and do well by themselves, as if that's some privilege that they have to be granted. It's not a privilege. It's a natural right to mix your labor with productive assets and create well-being for yourself and your family. And so not only I think it's inherently justified, I don't care if it generates more life expectancy, frankly. It does, and that's great, but that's not the reason we have it. And this idea that it's based on selfishness and greed is so misplaced, because what is the real selfishness in society? The real selfishness in society is to not make yourself useful in any productive capacity and to leech off others. That is what is selfish and greedy. And what capitalism does is it makes us selfless. It makes us productive members of society, recognizing that our job is to not be a leech on society. Our job is to create something useful, a useful product, a useful service that others will want. How do we know they want it? Because they buy it, right? So the market is not some dog-eat-dog awful. The market is how you know you're doing good for society. So again, this kind of means ends. This is typical academics, like, well, I have to put up with it. No, it has its own justification. The fact that it creates great wealth and great markets and great life expectancies, yeah, it doesn't surprise me, but that's not what drives the case for me.
Sean, do you have any, you're like the rebuttal on this, and you as well, Tarron. Do you have any response to some of what Bruce said?
Well, I mean, I think that, again, I'm a historian, and so, I always fight the battle between these kind of systems in their ideal form and the systems in which they work. And so, I think that you're right, that, again, the premise that you just used, Bruce, is based in the Enlightenment, right? That these truths are self-evident, right? That these human rights are inherent. And so it's no kind of coincidence, I think, that the systems of Republican government and capitalism kind of evolved at the same time, with this emphasis particularly on property. So to look back at the early Republic and the way that they justified your participation in society, it's exactly what you were talking about, because the reason why they excluded vast swaths of society from voting, for example, propertyless white men, women, slaves, wasn't necessarily because they were mean people. And if they had to come back and justify that, they would say, because they don't own property, they don't have a stake in society. They're not stakeholders, right? In the same way that you said, they're dependent. And the worst thing you can be to a Republican small r theorist is dependent. You need to be independent. You need to be able to make clear decisions without being influenced by anyone else. The reason why we don't give the vote to workers in the early Republic is because they'll just vote the way that their employer wants to. The reason we don't give it to slaves is they'll just vote the way their master wants to. The reason, and I'm saying this in the voice of an 18th century theorist, not my own, the reason we don't give women the right to vote is because they are naturally suited to not make clear-headed, rational decisions. It's why when Hamilton wanted to criticize Jefferson, he said he has a womanly attachment to France. And the reason why he gendered in that way is he was saying Jefferson has an emotional attachment to France. He's not thinking logically. So I guess that would be my rebuttal, is you're right. I think that you're right. And actually, I think that when I teach my class in American capitalism, what I purposely try to do, so when you asked me to sell capitalism, that was really difficult for me, because what I'm trying to do is get my students not to think that I'm trying to impress upon them or sell any particular view of capitalism, but get them to understand its strengths and weaknesses.
Well, then I'll ask you, Tarron, is part of the problem of understanding capitalism or saying that, yes, we are a capitalist country, do you think it's a lack of people understanding what capitalism is? Ask you first and then you, Bruce.
I don't know. I think our people are pretty smart. What I would say is I do believe capitalism, our system, has to deliver for us. So I do believe life expectancy is important. We would all like to live good, happy lives, and we need an economic system to deliver that. And that is why I brought that data here tonight to provoke some thought, because we win the most Nobel Prizes. We have great technical skills. We have the richest capitalists in the world. But our citizens, on average, are not living as long as they do in Chile. I'm not going to the developed countries or Costa Rica, just barely behind, in front of Costa Rica, or these are 2022 numbers. So I think, and I also believe that workers have a natural right. You know, I mean, we all have natural rights, and capitalists have natural rights. I mentioned a few minutes ago, I'm not a big fan. I don't think the wealth tax will work well. So how do we deal with the deficit and the debt? I have my opinions on that. Maybe we'll have another forum on that. But I don't think the wealth tax will be any effect. So I am not here to take away the natural rights of a billionaire. I think we all have natural rights, and I think workers must be seen as an important part of the capitalist system.
Bruce, before we get to your answer, just real quick, you mentioned Adam Smith, and it took a while for Adam Smith to come up in a big way tonight, which was surprising. As I mentioned, I have a 16-year-old son, and it was a great day for me when I drove him to school and said, "What are you learning in American history?" And he said, "Adam Smith." I was almost in tears. I was like, yes, high school does do something right here in Manatee County. Bruce, what do people understand capitalism? Is that part of the problem?
Well, no, so this is going to link back to what Sean said about, you know, the origins of republicanism and Republican theory. So Republican ideas of freedom were centered on this question of non-domination, right? That it wasn't enough simply to have these written rights. I could speak out, I could join a political party. These were just formal, right? The Republicans wanted a deep sense of freedom, and freedom for them is defined by you're not under the threat or domination of others, right? You're protected from capricious behavior. And so the reason why it's not enough to say private ownership makes you capitalist is because lots of countries have private ownership formally, but the private owners are subject to the capricious and arbitrary behavior of the state. That's what domination is. That renders it not ownership in the real sense of the term, non-dominated free ownership. It renders it just legalistic. I mean, half of China's economy is in private hands, but I tell you, there's not a single capitalist business owner in China, because every single capital owner in China is subject to the capricious and arbitrary behavior of the state. I'd say it's just more severe there, plus the fact that China has a large state sector, which ours is less so. But it's about domination rather than private ownership.
Excellent. All right, we're going to move on. We're going to open it up to questions from the audience. I have one from the iPad here. A system in which private actors control companies but may be redirected to benefit government priorities is called National Socialism. Is that our system? Tarron, we'll start with you.
No, I don't think that's our system. I believe our governments are democratically elected, and they have a mandate to do, to make policies. There are mistakes in policies, and they are good. I just gave you two examples. I think it's a good idea to make sure the airlines are more competitive.
Even if they go bankrupt?
Even if they go bankrupt. And it's also, someone else will create a better airline than Spirit. Trust me, Spirit is not the model for flying. I mean, I'm pretty sure about that. It's a very, and I do believe that that a mistaken policy was made by not allowing more consolidation in the regional banks. So that's I don't think we live for the state, or the state is the end all in this country. I mean, we have a pretty effective bureaucracy, and we have, I mean, I don't like the term predatory state, because I don't believe the American federal government is predatory, because in development economics, we have a precise definition of what we mean by a predatory state, a mixed state, and a developmental state. And maybe somebody should write a book on how getting rid of the spoils system from 1883. I would be curious, we have an economic historian here to help us to understand how creating a more effective civil bureaucracy has worked well for us, right? So, but I do not believe that because you have a civil bureaucracy, it's it's the thing that guides the system. No, I don't.
Bruce, is that our system? Do you think National Socialism?
I think there are sectors which at times are like National Socialism. I think if you look at the compelled drug price negotiations that Medicare has introduced, that is National Socialism. That is literally commandeering an entire industry for government purposes against its will.
Sean, your perspective, also from the historical perspective.
You know, what I think is really interesting is, so when I was selling capitalism earlier, that's obviously the idealized version of capitalism. And when we look at it in a historical context, so let me use, for example, the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, I believe, which Theodore Roosevelt, in many ways, doesn't get enough credit for saving capitalism, American capitalism, industrial capitalism, because what he did was he kind of softened it in many ways. And the Pure Food and Drug Act is one of them, in that he personally had found out during the Spanish-American War that many American meat manufacturers were finding rats and bugs and all sorts of horrible stuff. People were dying from the tinned meat. And of course, the idealist, the pure capitalist, the capitalism I just sold you, would say, well, you can't impede upon an individual's right to make that. And what Adam Smith's Visible Hand tells us, that after a few generations of people dying from somebody's meat, they will go out of business, right? That's cold comfort for someone who watched their family keel over after they ate a can of meat. And so I think that we have the ideal system, and then we have the role of the state. And the role of the state has been the big issue that I think political scientists and historians and economists have debated for years and years and years. Even when we can all agree upon the kind of basic dynamics of a capitalist system, the reason why I wanted to bring up the New Deal was that's the big thing that we're struggling with. What is the appropriate role of the American state? Bruce says it's predatory. It could be seen as regulatory. Now I'm really going to be annoying as a historian. I'm a historian. I'm not talking about the present or the future. But I think that, are we National Socialists? No. Because I'm surprised nobody clued in what National Socialism means. In a historic sense, no, absolutely not. But are we socialists? No, we're not socialist either, I would argue.
I mean, we also have to be aware that we have to be very careful that the government or the bureaucracy may not do its work effectively because of the lobbying power of moneyed interests, right? We have to be very aware of regulatory capture, rent seeking, right? And I am particularly worried that the guy who has billions of dollars in contracts from the federal government is now going to be responsible for bringing efficiency to the federal government. There's a serious conflict of interest here. Sometimes I want to know if I'm in Guyana,
Well, it's only going to take him 18 months, though.
And it's going to take him 18 months, right?
We got another question, and it says it's for Tarron, but I think, well, anybody can answer, but it's for Bruce who want to answer it as well. Tarron listed many examples of how the U.S. is declining. Would this not be a sign of the U.S. moving away from capitalism and being drowned by a predatory government?
No, I don't think it's because of a predatory government. I think it's because the government cannot function effectively as it would function in, let's say, Singapore, because of the regulatory capture of lobbyists and special interests. That is why the U.S. capitalist...
So you're saying that the reason that the FTC blocked the Spirit merger is because the FTC lobbyists got in there and told them to regulate themselves out of business?
No, Spirit is a very single, specific example. I mean, there are many examples of laws on all these things that are. Why did we wither away? Why did we wither away Glass-Steagall of the 30s, right? Glass-Steagall was slowly weakened. But if you look at the data from the 1930s until the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, there was a lull in bond crisis overall relative to pre-Glass-Steagall, right? Why did that happen? The financial lobby weakened Glass-Steagall, okay? Now, what is happening? This is what's happening. So we have Dodd-Frank, and what Dodd-Frank does is it requires the banks to hold more capital. Why? Because we're trying to solve the moral hazard problem that we had when banks are melting down, as they did in 07, 08, that the government has to step in and bail them out. I don't care which government was in power. Politically, it's the most difficult thing to let Citibank fail. Imagine Citibank failing, right? Or Bank of America, right? So Dodd-Frank was meant to deal with this moral hazard problem. And what is happening? The Trump administration started, the previous Trump administration, the weakening of Dodd-Frank. And you know what's going to happen? This is what's going to happen. MicroStrategy. Pay careful attention to MicroStrategy, the company that uses leverage to buy cryptocurrencies, particularly Bitcoin, right? I mean, it's very, very worrying. You should be scared, right? So what's happening is, what I think the next Trump administration will weaken financial regulations, right? To an extent where it will set the seeds for a future crisis, financial crisis. Because it took many years, right? It's difficult to pinpoint a specific event, but in 2004, one of the key deregulations that happened was when they allowed the leverage ratio to go above a certain threshold. And that resulted in subprime, and so we can do all these things. So I think the financial industry presents a great example, not spirit, as to how the power of the lobbying interest can work against workers' interests and all of our interests.
Glass-Steagall, part of the first New Deal. I just want to make that point.
Yeah, so Dodd-Frank did nothing to decrease the risk in the financial system, and the Glass-Steagall destruction would have happened with or without lobbyists, because it was a globalization of the financial system. The main reason we had a global financial crisis in 2007-8 was because of an excessively loose monetary policy that stoked excessive mortgages, excessive purchases, basically a bubble created by bad monetary policy. Now, I do agree with Tarron that the reason why Dodd-Frank is popular with the big banks is because they're the only ones that can pay all the compliance costs of complying with this monstrous legislation. And indeed, the first Trump administration proposed an off-ramp for small banks, allow them to not have to hold the capital that was required under Dodd-Frank, and to comply with all the Dodd-Frank regulations. The big banks shut it down. Right, so this is what I'm saying, is that actually the predatory state first predates against the small and medium businesses. We may be kind of aligned on that. But what's left is the big businesses who pay the compliance costs and then comply with whatever woke ESG, pay equity, unnecessary regulations the big state demands. And the result is workers' wages are lower. And Tarron's data does not include social transfers and investment income, which means inequality has not worsened at all. This is the work of Phil Graham and his colleagues, which have shown the whole inequality narrative is incorrect because it's only based on wage income, not on total income of households.
No, I mean, my data sets are different. We're using the top 1% for wealth, and the second thing I did was to use the labor share compensation, which includes benefits and these transfers, right? The third thing is the Gini coefficient. I have to double check whether it tackles these transfers, but I'm aware of that study, and it's not. I don't agree with it that it would change the trajectory of inequality, wealth and income inequality. No, I do not agree that the financial crisis of the Great Recession, the crisis, was because of loose monetary policy. The interest rate was way higher then. It was a set of deregulations that allowed excess leverage in the system, right? That led to subprime lending and so on. And there's asymmetric information in the system where you had corruption and so on.
I'm going to cut you off because we're running a couple more questions. One directed to Sean. Is breaking up monopolies the best way to encourage competition in industries dominated by a few large companies? If not, what would be the best alternative?
Well, what's interesting about antitrust is if you look at the origins of it, the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890, which was meant to do exactly that. It was meant to break up big companies so that they would be more competitive. What it actually did was, the way it was interpreted again by the Supreme Court, was it made businesses bigger. In that what it did was it outlawed what they called loose combinations like cartels and trusts and so forth. But it didn't outlaw tight combinations. And antitrust, I guess, again, I'm being evasive. If you look at the history of it, there's a couple really interesting cases. So my answer to the question, because I have to answer the question, I can't be evasive, would be yes. That is a good way to ensure competition. And let me give you an example. Alcoa, which had a commanding share of aluminum in the United States in the post-war period, was broken up and actually increased its profits. I think in part because they were forced to be more competitive. The federal government came in, literally assigned percentages of market share to 3 major aluminum companies, and rather than kind of falter because they didn't have this overwhelming market share, Alcoa actually had some of its more profitable years and became, as a result, more innovative. So, yeah, I think that ultimately history shows that that's the case, and I think it's the case in the future, too.
Got another question. Start with you, Bruce. Do we think the concentration of wealth, think Soros, Gates, and Musk, is a problem? If we admit that it is a problem, how can we fix it?
Yeah, it's only a problem if you're a person of resentment. Why would you care that people are getting fabulously wealthy by producing fabulously awesome, world-beating products and services? I mean, resentment is the only answer, and that's, I think, one of the 7 deadly sins, actually. But I think the bigger issue is, look, as the economy globalizes, right, and as the American economy grows, to be the top 1% in the American economy is not the right way of looking at it. You should look at them, they're global entrepreneurs, they have global companies. So they are the top of a global economy. Of course, that makes them the top in the American economy, but of course that proportion, as the American economy globalizes, will command a bigger share of the American economy because their actual economy of reference is the global economy, not the American one. And don't forget to go back to, John Rawls, his famous difference principle, if you know the theory of justice, and Rawls was a good old, dyed-in-the-wool, liberal Democrat guy, right? He said, if you really care about the workers, if you really care about the people on the bottom of the income distribution, stop obsessing about the rich and just design your institutions to make the working class as well off as they can be. And don't obsess about how much the rich have, because if you do, you'll end up not focusing on what you should be focusing on, which is making the lower classes as well off as they can be. And that's why Rawls put that principle in. He said, that's the big mistake that liberals have made, is obsessing about wealth distribution when they should be obsessing about how well off people in the lower end of the income scale are.
Anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would think it only becomes a problem. I'm fine with people getting rich. It only becomes a problem if, because of that wealth, they're able to pay for writing the laws in their favor. That's when it becomes a problem, right? That's the only time for me when being wealthy matters, right? But I'm fine, as I said. It's great for people to get rich. I don't wake up in the morning. I wake up in the morning thinking about which economics paper I can write.
More money. Sean, anything to add to that? A couple more questions. Can capitalism include the substantial redistribution of wealth through taxes for social welfare programs? Who wants to tackle that one?
Well, it does. It does right now. In California, the top 1% of income earners generate more than 50% of the income tax in the state, and nationally, it's not far behind that. So we have a massive redistribution of income in this country. There's nothing specifically wrong with that. It's just that, the basic law of economics is when you tax something, people do less of it, right? So when you tax work, people work less. When you tax profits, companies will make less profits. In some ways, we tax cigarettes so that people don't smoke. But taxing income will create economically rational behavior of people doing less of it. That's why so many of the Eastern European countries coming out of communism have just gone with flat tax rates, because they know they need to fund their governments, but they don't want to disincentivize any particular group, so they've gone with flat tax rates. It's also much easier to administer that way. And if you do a flat tax rate, you end up having to do much less redistribution because the overall tax rate is low in the first place.
Got one more historical type question. Start with you, Sean. The question for tonight implies that America was once a capitalist country with the word still. Is there a time that America was more capitalist?
More capitalist, what would that mean? I guess if you want to view capitalism, as it's been posited here, as a system with a minimal amount of government interference, I suppose you can make an argument for the late 19th century being most capitalist. However, I would argue that in the late 19th century, because of the challenges of populism and then eventually socialism, a series of really horrific strikes at Homestead in 1892 and Pullman and in Chicago a few years later, that this was also the period in which capitalism looked like it was essentially going to destroy itself. And it's one of the reasons why I think we often think of FDR and the New Deal as kind of, well, depending on your side of the political fence, either saving capitalism or ruining capitalism, but nonetheless having a big impact on capitalism, and it's why I love the first New Deal so much. I think it's Theodore Roosevelt in many ways who, right around the turn of the century, as I said, he kind of softened the blows of those places. I'll give you an example really quickly. The 1902 anthracite strike, which I write about coal, so this is near and dear to my heart, was an example where you really saw the power of consumers and Theodore Roosevelt respecting the powers of consumers. And at the heart of capitalism, American capitalism particularly, is the consumer, right? We are a consumer republic. Consumers in many ways drive this republic. And consumers were looking at surviving a cold northern winter in places like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia without any coal. And the way that folks assumed this strike was going to work was the owners of the coal mines were going to call upon the federal government. The federal government was going to find some excuse to use force to break up the UMW, and eventually those coal miners would have to slink back to work, and there would be coal flowing again. That, in many ways, is industrial capitalism at its kind of apex. But what Roosevelt did was he intervened and did what's ultimately not a very kind of romantic or exciting thing. He set up a commission and did impose the federal government rule on this strike and eventually settled it. And now, did this then careen into a kind of predatory state, the way that Bruce has said? Perhaps, over the next century or so. But I think that intervention is really significant, and we don't often give TR enough credit for doing that. He also, for example, came up with the idea that we can, the question earlier about trusts. In many ways, what antitrust has often done is said, there's a certain level of market share that is monopolistic and it needs to be broken up, whether or not that company is acting well or not, right? So the argument is, if you like competition, yes, break them up. But sometimes companies that are near monopolistic do pretty good things for us, right? And so what Roosevelt argued was, TR, not FDR, there are good trusts and bad trusts, right? We should not necessarily break up a company just because it has 90% market share. We should break up a company like Standard Oil, which got broken up in 1911, because they are actively repressing competition, and that is not capitalist.
Yeah.
So that's the way I would answer that question.
That's a great answer. I like it.
Excellent, great. Well, I know we redid the poll. I don't know if you guys had seen it. Looks like yes wins by a decent margin. Excellent. Well, it is 7:30. It's been a pleasure.
That's the best split we've had in any Socratic stage event, so thank you for
the best split.
well, diversity of like
Right.
Yeah.
So it's been
It's usually higher, like 90%?
yeah.
One.
Yeah,
Oh,
so
okay.
that's good.
excellent. A lot of different opinions. It's been a pleasure from hearing from all of you this evening. Thank you for taking the time to join us about such important topics. To everyone who attended, thank you for coming tonight. Have a great night.
Thank you.